Believe me, they got the message. And thousands of terrorists dropped to the ground. We destroyed Assad's armaments in Syria. We deterred Iran's Shiite militias in Iraq. And most importantly, and above anything else that I could say to you or that we did in this past year, in this past decade, we devastated Iran's atomic weapons and ballistic missiles program.
57 lives cut short in a single night. Families wiped out in seconds. Premature babies in incubators struggling to breathe as bombs fall just streets away. Gaza City, once a vibrant hub of life, now a graveyard of shattered buildings and broken hope. The world watches, some in silence, others in outrage, as Israel presses forward with an assault it says must finish the job. But for the hundreds of thousands trapped inside the Strip, there is no escape, no safe haven, only survival against impossible odds. This is the story the headlines won't tell you in full. The human toll, the politics, and the growing storm that may redefine the future of the Middle East. Welcome back to Great Britain, where we go beyond the surface of breaking global events to uncover the deeper truths shaping our world today. If you're new here, make sure to hit subscribe, give this video a like, and share it so more people can join this conversation. The stories we're about to unpack matter to every single one of us, because wars don't just destroy cities, they ripple across borders, economies, and generations. Tonight, we dive into the escalating conflict in Gaza, a conflict that has already cost the lives of at least 57 Palestinians in the past 24 hours alone, with the vast majority of deaths concentrated in Gaza City. And yet, despite mounting international pressure for a ceasefire, Israel continues to press ahead with a military operation it calls essential, while critics call it devastating, disproportionate, and potentially genocidal. This isn't just another headline. This is an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, and it is happening right now. According to health officials in Gaza, Israeli strikes have ripped through densely populated areas, with some of the deadliest attacks striking the Nuseirat refugee camp. In one tragic incident, 9 members of the same family were killed inside their own home. Hours later, another strike in the same area claimed 13 more lives, including women and children. Staff at Al-Ata Hospital were left to receive the bodies, describing scenes of devastation and grief too raw to process. In another part of the territory, Nasser Hospital confirmed that 5 more people were killed when a strike hit a tent sheltering displaced families. Imagine that for a moment. Already forced from their homes by war, seeking refuge in makeshift tents, only to be struck down by the very missiles they were hoping to escape. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, when pressed, said they had no awareness of deaths by gunfire in southern Gaza and offered no immediate comment on the airstrikes themselves. For many critics, this silence speaks volumes. But perhaps most alarming of all is the fate of Gaza's fragile health system. In Gaza City, the director of Shifa Hospital, one of the largest medical facilities in the Strip, issued a chilling warning. Israeli tanks were reported to be approaching the vicinity of the hospital, restricting access. Inside, 159 patients were still being treated with nowhere to go. Dr. Mohammed Abu Salmiya, the hospital's director, told reporters, "The bombardment has not stopped for a single moment." His words cut through the static of war reports like a knife. Because when bombs fall nonstop, even hospitals, meant to be sanctuaries of healing, become cages of despair. And the situation doesn't stop there. In Helu Hospital, 14 premature babies are being kept alive in incubators. Their survival depends on uninterrupted electricity and medical supplies, both of which are dwindling fast. Yet, as Dr. Nasser Bulbul, head of neonatal intensive care, revealed, the hospital's main gate had been shut down because of drones circling overhead. That's right, drones literally prevented doctors and aid workers from moving freely to help save infants fighting for their lives. This is not just war. This is humanitarian collapse in real time. All this comes as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the UN General Assembly in New York, declaring that Israel must finish the job in Gaza. His speech, however, was met with visible resistance. Dozens of delegates from different nations staged a walkout as soon as Netanyahu took to the podium, a symbolic protest against Israel's ongoing military campaign. Outside the UN, protesters filled the streets, holding banners and chanting for an end to what they called war crimes and genocide. The timing of his speech was remarkable. As bombs rained down on Gaza, Netanyahu stood before the world's most powerful leaders, defending the very actions that were killing civilians in real time. In a move that stunned many observers, Israeli authorities even went so far as to broadcast Netanyahu's UN speech directly into Gaza. Trucks with loudspeakers were deployed along the border, blaring his words across the strip. There were also unverified claims that Israeli forces had hijacked local phone lines to push his message into Palestinian homes. Whether or not the phone hacking occurred, the symbolism was clear. This was psychological warfare, an attempt to project dominance even as the humanitarian crisis spiraled out of control. And yet, the world is beginning to shift. A UN Commission of Inquiry recently concluded that Israel has committed acts of genocide in Gaza, a finding that has sent shockwaves through international diplomacy. Meanwhile, an increasing number of countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Australia, have formally recognized Palestinian statehood in recent weeks. This represents a seismic shift in global opinion. For decades, Western powers have largely stood by Israel, citing its right to self-defense. But now, as images of starving children, bombed-out hospitals, and mass graves circulate online, that support is fracturing. Médecins Sans Frontières, one of the world's most respected medical charities, announced just days ago that it had been forced to suspend all activities in Gaza City. Their clinics were surrounded by Israeli forces, leaving doctors no choice but to abandon their posts. "This is the last thing we wanted," said Jacob Granger, their emergency coordinator. But the most at-risk people, infants, people with severe injuries, people with life-threatening illnesses, cannot move. They are in grave danger. So where does that leave us? On one side, a military determined to achieve what it calls security goals at all costs. On the other, a population trapped in one of the most densely populated strips of land on Earth, with dwindling supplies, collapsing infrastructure, and little to no international protection. This is not just a conflict between Israel and Hamas. This is a conflict where civilians, ordinary men, women, and children, are paying the highest price. And as the international community debates, delays, and deliberates, those trapped inside Gaza have no time left to wait. That was just the beginning. In the next part of this documentary, we'll break down why Israel insists on pressing forward, the political calculations behind Netanyahu's defiance, and how this conflict is reshaping global alliances from Washington to London, from Paris to Canberra. As the world grapples with the images of destruction in Gaza, the question arises, why does Israel continue its relentless assault despite international outcry? The answer lies in a combination of political strategy, military objectives, and what many critics call an alarming disregard for civilian life. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, addressing the UN General Assembly, stated plainly that Israel must finish the job in Gaza. For him and his government, this campaign is framed as a matter of national security, a fight against terrorism, a response to rocket fire, and an attempt to weaken Hamas, the ruling authority in the Gaza Strip. Yet, as the bombs fall and hospitals close, the line between military target and civilian casualty grows increasingly blurred. Even as delegations walked out of the UN General Assembly in protest, and as the world condemned the strikes as disproportionate, Israel pursued its operations with unrelenting force. The message was clear: no international pressure will halt their mission. The toll is staggering. Beyond the 57 confirmed deaths in recent days, countless more have been wounded, with hospitals overwhelmed, medical supplies running out, and doctors forced to abandon their posts under threat. Médecins Sans Frontières, unable to protect its staff or patients, suspended operations entirely in Gaza City. Families are living in constant fear. In the Nuseirat refugee camp, survivors describe scenes of chaos and devastation. Collapsed homes, the bodies of loved ones, and children left alone amid rubble. Tent shelters, once a safe haven for the displaced, have been bombed. People who survived the initial strikes are now trapped in a cycle of trauma, starvation, and exposure to relentless violence. Dr. Mohammed Abu Selmiya, director of Shifa Hospital, said, "The bombardment has not stopped for a single moment. And yet, even amid these harrowing conditions, health workers continue their efforts, a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity." Perhaps one of the most striking actions in this conflict is Israel's unprecedented decision to broadcast Netanyahu's UN speech directly into Gaza. Loudspeakers mounted on trucks blared the prime minister's words across the city, and authorities claimed they had hijacked local phone lines to reach residents and Hamas members directly. While there is no verified evidence that phone lines were actually controlled, the act itself symbolized a new form of psychological warfare. Critics argue it is not merely a strategic move, but a provocation, a deliberate attempt to assert dominance and intimidate the population already suffering under airstrikes. This tactic sparked outrage among human rights organizations and international observers. For many, it epitomizes the imbalance of power in this conflict. One side striking relentlessly, the other caught in a desperate struggle for survival. Gaza's health sector is collapsing under the weight of sustained attacks. 2 clinics have already been destroyed, 2 hospitals have shut down after being damaged, and others are barely functioning. Medicine, equipment, and food are in critically short supply. Many doctors and nurses have fled, leaving patients without care. Helu Hospital, which treats premature babies, remains operational only because of the extraordinary efforts of its remaining staff. 14 infants in incubators are at constant risk, their survival dependent on continuous power and supplies, both of which are increasingly scarce. Drones flying over the hospital have forced staff to close the main gates, further limiting access to emergency care. The suffering extends beyond hospitals. Families are unable to access clean water, electricity, or safe shelter. Displacement has reached staggering numbers, and humanitarian corridors, even when negotiated, are often too dangerous to reach. Children, the elderly, and the sick bear the brunt of these conditions. Amid this devastation, international pressure on Israel has grown. A UN Commission of Inquiry concluded that Israel has committed acts of genocide in Gaza, a statement that has shocked the world and sparked debates over the legality and morality of Israel's military actions. Several countries, including the UK, France, Canada, and Australia, have formally recognized Palestinian statehood in recent weeks. This recognition is not merely symbolic. It signals a shift in global opinion and challenges decades of near-universal support for Israel from Western powers. Protests around the world have intensified, calling for immediate ceasefires and humanitarian aid. Social media amplifies these voices, spreading images and stories from Gaza to millions of viewers worldwide. Yet, despite the pressure, Israel shows no signs of halting its offensive. Why does Israel persist? Analysts suggest that Netanyahu's government sees this offensive as crucial for both domestic and regional reasons. Domestically, demonstrating a firm hand against Hamas strengthens his political position and appeals to his voter base. Regionally, weakening Hamas serves as a warning to other groups in the Middle East who might challenge Israel's authority or engage in cross-border attacks. Yet, this strategy comes with profound consequences. Each strike, each civilian casualty, and each destroyed hospital further isolates Israel diplomatically. The psychological impact on Gaza's residents fuels anger and resentment, potentially creating new cycles of radicalization and violence. Amid these geopolitical calculations, it's crucial to remember the human stories. Families who have lived in Gaza for generations are witnessing the destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals. Children cannot attend school safely. Parents cannot provide for their families, and the elderly face an uncertain future in a war-torn city. Local journalists and hospital staff share accounts of extreme trauma. Patients waiting hours for critical surgeries, mothers crying over infants who may not survive the night, and neighborhoods reduced to rubble after airstrikes. These are not just statistics. These are human lives disrupted and destroyed in a matter of moments. As the night falls over Gaza, the bombardment continues. The streets are silent except for the sounds of drones overhead, explosions in the distance, and the cries of those who have lost everything. International actors debate and deliberate, but inside Gaza, every second counts. This is the reality of war in the 21st century, a combination of conventional military power, psychological operations, and a humanitarian crisis unfolding before the eyes of the world. And while the global community struggles to respond, the people of Gaza continue to face the unimaginable. We will explore the role of international organizations, the response of the United Nations, and the broader political implications for global powers, including how the recognition of Palestinian statehood by multiple nations may reshape the Middle East. As the devastation in Gaza continues, the eyes of the world turn toward the international community. Governments, organizations, and humanitarian agencies are grappling with one of the most urgent crises of the decade. The question is no longer just about immediate survival for the people of Gaza, but also about how the world responds to violations of international law and basic human rights. The United Nations has been vocal in its condemnation of the attacks. Following the airstrikes and ground operations, multiple UN agencies issued statements highlighting the collapse of healthcare, the destruction of homes, and the dire need for humanitarian corridors. UNICEF has repeatedly warned about the risk to children, particularly infants in neonatal care units who face extreme danger as hospitals struggle to maintain operations under bombardment. A UN Commission inquiry has gone even further, stating that Israel has committed acts of genocide in Gaza. The report has shocked many, especially as it names specific actions and policies that have contributed to civilian deaths, the destruction of essential infrastructure, and widespread displacement. These findings have intensified calls for an international response, both diplomatically and through humanitarian assistance. In the wake of the crisis, several countries have formally recognized Palestinian statehood. The United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Australia have all announced their decisions, marking a significant shift in international opinion. For decades, the recognition of Palestine has been a contentious political issue. These recent decisions are not just symbolic. They signal a willingness to challenge Israel diplomatically and affirm the rights of the Palestinian people. Recognition also carries geopolitical implications. It strengthens the Palestinian position in international negotiations and increases pressure on Israel to reconsider its military tactics and occupation policies. At the same time, it complicates relations with countries that have historically aligned themselves with Israel, particularly the United States and some European nations. Organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, the Red Cross, and the World Health Organization are operating under extreme conditions. MSF's suspension of activities in Gaza City, due to encirclement by Israeli forces, highlights the perilous situation for aid workers. Without access to the sick, injured, and vulnerable, the humanitarian crisis deepens exponentially. Jacob Granger, MSF's emergency coordinator, described the situation. The most at-risk people, infants in neonatal care, people with severe injuries and life-threatening illnesses, are unable to move and are in grave danger. The international community is scrambling to provide aid, but logistical challenges, airspace restrictions, and active combat zones severely limit what can be done. Meanwhile, diplomacy is at a critical juncture. Delegations of the UN General Assembly have called for ceasefires and negotiated safe corridors for civilians. Protesters outside the assembly halls, as well as in major cities worldwide, have demanded an end to Israeli attacks and stronger international intervention. Israel, however, continues its strategy, broadcasting Prime Minister Netanyahu's UN speech into Gaza, an act that many interpret as both psychological warfare and political messaging. The move has sparked outrage from human rights groups and drawn criticism from governments worldwide. Major global powers, including the United States, Russia, China, and members of the European Union, are navigating a complex landscape. The U.S. has traditionally been a staunch ally of Israel, but increasing public awareness of civilian casualties and humanitarian crises has sparked debate among lawmakers and human rights advocates. Russia and China have criticized Israel's military tactics, framing the conflict within the broader context of human rights and international law. The EU, balancing its relationships with Israel and Arab states, has urged restraint and called for immediate humanitarian assistance. The sustained Israeli offensive has significant consequences beyond Gaza. It risks destabilizing the broader Middle East, inflaming tensions with neighboring countries, and triggering a refugee crisis. Thousands of Palestinians are displaced, and without safe routes or assistance, many are trapped in combat zones. Moreover, the continued violence fuels a narrative of oppression, radicalization, and resentment that has long-term implications for regional security. Every strike on civilian infrastructure, every hospital closed, and every child killed contributes to a growing cycle of conflict. The world is now forced to grapple with the moral and ethical dimensions of this conflict. How should countries respond when an allied state is accused of committing acts of genocide? What responsibility do governments, international organizations, and civil society have to intervene? These questions are not merely academic. They carry real-world consequences for policy decisions, humanitarian aid distribution, and diplomatic negotiations. The international community is being tested on its ability to protect the most vulnerable and uphold the principles of international law. Amid political maneuvering and international debate, the voices of Gaza's residents remain central. Survivors describe life under constant threat, the anguish of losing family members, and the daily struggle to access food, water, and medical care. Their stories, broadcast through journalists, social media, and aid workers, humanize a conflict often reduced to statistics and diplomatic statements. Experts argue that without immediate ceasefires, humanitarian aid, and diplomatic pressure, the crisis will worsen. International bodies must coordinate to ensure the safe delivery of supplies, protect civilians, and create frameworks for accountability. Long-term solutions require addressing the root causes of the conflict, including territorial disputes, governance issues, and the cycle of retaliatory violence. We will examine the historical context of the Gaza conflict, previous ceasefires, and what lessons can be learned from decades of war in the region. To truly understand the current crisis in Gaza, we must look back at the historical context that has shaped this protracted conflict. The Gaza Strip, a small coastal territory along the eastern Mediterranean, has been at the epicenter of the Israeli-Palestinian struggle for decades. Its story is one of displacement, military occupation, political strife, and cycles of violence that have repeated over generations. Following the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes, many settling in Gaza as refugees. The region has since been governed under various administrations, including Egyptian control until 1967 and then Israeli occupation after the Six-Day War. The establishment of settlements, restrictions on movement, and military control set the stage for decades of tension. Hamas, a Palestinian political and militant organization, gained influence in Gaza during the early 2000s, culminating in its control over the territory in 2007. Since then, Israel has maintained a strict blockade, citing security concerns, while the residents of Gaza face severe restrictions on movement, trade, and access to basic resources. This historical backdrop explains why the region is so volatile and why every military escalation has far-reaching consequences. Over the years, numerous ceasefires have been brokered, often mediated by international actors such as Egypt, Qatar, and the United Nations. These ceasefires typically followed periods of intense conflict, such as the Gaza wars of 2008 to 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021. While they have provided temporary reprieves, the underlying issues, territorial disputes, political control, and humanitarian crises have remained unresolved. Each ceasefire has been fragile, often collapsing under renewed military activity, provocations, or political disagreements. Civilians in Gaza have learned that periods of relative calm can be fleeting. Hospitals, schools, and residential areas remain vulnerable, and the international community's ability to enforce or maintain ceasefires has been inconsistent. The repeated cycles of violence have left a profound impact on Gaza's population. Generations of Palestinians have grown up knowing nothing but war, displacement, and economic hardship. Infrastructure is chronically damaged, healthcare systems are overburdened, and education is frequently interrupted. The psychological toll on children, families, and communities is immense. Doctors, aid workers, and human rights organizations have repeatedly warned about the long-term effects of these conflicts. Access to clean water, electricity, and medical supplies is limited, and the destruction of homes and public buildings continues to hinder reconstruction efforts. The current crisis, with dozens of civilians killed in recent strikes, is a stark reminder of how past conflicts have left Gaza exceptionally vulnerable. Several lessons emerge from decades of conflict in Gaza. Ceasefires provide temporary relief, but not lasting peace. Without addressing the root causes, political governance, territorial disputes, and civilian protection, conflict is likely to resume. International intervention is critical, but often inconsistent. While organizations like the UN and Médecins Sans Frontières provide essential support, their efforts are constrained by security risks and political barriers. Civilians bear the brunt of hostilities. From housing destruction to healthcare shortages, it is clear that ordinary people are the primary victims, highlighting the urgent need for protective measures and humanitarian corridors. Global awareness and advocacy matter. International recognition of Palestinian statehood and media coverage of civilian suffering have the potential to influence diplomatic negotiations and pressure governments to act responsibly. The ongoing attacks in Gaza, including strikes on hospitals, refugee camps, and residential areas, reflect a disturbing pattern observed in previous conflicts. The international community's response has often been reactive rather than proactive, emphasizing the need for stronger mechanisms to protect civilians and prevent escalation. The use of psychological tactics, such as broadcasting speeches into Gaza, demonstrates how modern warfare extends beyond bombs and bullets. Propaganda, control of information, and strategic communication are increasingly central to conflicts, complicating both humanitarian relief and political negotiation. Media coverage plays a critical role in shaping global understanding of the conflict. Images of destruction, stories of civilian suffering, and reports from aid organizations bring attention to the humanitarian crisis, influencing public opinion and diplomatic discourse. Social media, in particular, allows Palestinians to share first-hand accounts, giving voice to those trapped in conflict zones. However, media narratives can also be manipulated, with selective reporting sometimes shaping perceptions of responsibility or justification. Accurate, unbiased reporting is essential to ensure the world understands the realities on the ground. History shows that without meaningful political solutions, the cycle of violence will continue. Diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and international recognition of Palestinian rights must go hand in hand with efforts to prevent military escalation. Ceasefires should be designed not just as temporary pauses, but as opportunities to address underlying grievances, rebuild infrastructure, and secure safe conditions for civilians. The lessons of Gaza's past underscore a clear truth. Sustainable peace requires more than military strategies or temporary political agreements. It demands long-term commitment from all stakeholders, local, regional, and international, to uphold human rights, ensure justice, and protect those most vulnerable. As the humanitarian crisis in Gaza worsens, the international community has increasingly stepped into the spotlight, calling for urgent intervention and ceasefires. The ongoing attacks have not gone unnoticed, and global leaders, NGOs, and human rights organizations are all sounding alarms about the escalating violence and civilian suffering. The United Nations has been at the forefront of diplomatic efforts. Following the latest strikes, UN officials have expressed grave concern over the deaths of civilians, the destruction of hospitals, and the severe disruption of essential services. A UN commission recently found evidence suggesting that Israel's actions may constitute genocide in Gaza, intensifying calls for accountability and an immediate cessation of hostilities. Several countries, including the UK, France, Canada, and Australia, have formally recognized Palestinian statehood. These decisions reflect a growing global consensus that the Palestinian people deserve protection, sovereignty, and support amidst ongoing conflict. The recognition also places additional diplomatic pressure on Israel to halt military operations and engage in meaningful dialogue. Regional actors, particularly Egypt and Qatar, have historically played pivotal roles in mediating ceasefires and humanitarian access. Egypt has often acted as a conduit between Israel and Gaza, negotiating temporary truces and allowing humanitarian corridors. Qatar has provided both financial aid and political support to ensure the delivery of essential resources, such as food, medicine, and fuel, to civilians trapped in conflict zones. Despite these efforts, ceasefires have repeatedly been fragile. Misunderstandings, political disagreements, and renewed military actions have quickly undermined temporary agreements. The current escalation underscores the challenge of maintaining stability in a region with deep-seated historical grievances and entrenched military tensions. International NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières and the Red Cross have faced unprecedented challenges operating in Gaza. Encircled by military activity, their ability to deliver aid is severely restricted. Jacob Granger, emergency coordinator for MSF, described the situation as dire. "We have been left with no choice but to stop our activities as our clinics are encircled by Israeli forces. The most vulnerable, infants, people with severe injuries, are unable to move and remain in grave danger." These organizations continue to advocate for safe corridors and the protection of medical facilities, highlighting the urgent need for compliance with international humanitarian law. Yet, access remains perilously limited, exacerbating the civilian toll and delaying life-saving assistance. Around the world, citizens are organizing protests, vigils, and awareness campaigns to highlight the suffering in Gaza. Streets from London to Paris, Ottawa to Sydney have seen crowds waving Palestinian flags, holding signs, and demanding international intervention. Social media amplifies these voices, providing a platform for ordinary citizens to express solidarity and urge their governments to take decisive action. The public outcry has placed additional pressure on world leaders to act swiftly, enforce ceasefires, and hold accountable those responsible for violations of human rights. Diplomatic efforts are complicated by the geopolitical stakes involved. Israel has the backing of key allies who prioritize strategic, security, and political interests, while Gaza's plight is often overshadowed by broader regional concerns. The balance between ensuring Israel's security and protecting Palestinian civilians remains a contentious issue in international negotiations. Moreover, the broadcasting of Netanyahu's UN speech directly into Gaza via military loudspeakers demonstrates the intricate interplay of modern warfare, propaganda, and psychological operations. These actions not only impact civilians, but also complicate efforts for a neutral, balanced diplomatic solution. Despite the overwhelming challenges, several avenues remain critical for international action. Immediate humanitarian corridors, safe passage for civilians, medical staff, and aid organizations is essential. Unhindered access to hospitals, clinics, and supply routes must be guaranteed. Ceasefire enforcement. Regional mediators and global powers need to actively enforce agreements to prevent renewed hostilities. Accountability and oversight. International legal mechanisms should ensure that violations of human rights and international law are investigated and addressed. Sustained diplomatic engagement. Long-term peace requires multilateral dialogue involving Israel, Palestinian authorities, regional actors, and the international community. The coming weeks are crucial. Diplomatic pressure, humanitarian action, and public advocacy will determine whether the cycle of violence can be halted or if Gaza will continue to endure indiscriminate attacks, collapsing infrastructure, and escalating civilian casualties. As the situation in Gaza evolves, the role of the international community is more critical than ever. From UN interventions to grassroots protests, global voices are calling for a cessation of hostilities and immediate aid to civilians. Hospitals under siege, families mourning lost loved ones, and a population trapped in fear are at the heart of this crisis. The challenge is immense, but the need for decisive, compassionate action has never been clearer. Gaza's future, its people's safety, and the possibility of lasting peace depend on the global community's willingness to intervene responsibly, uphold international law, and prioritize human life above all else. The Gaza conflict is more than a local humanitarian crisis. It has far-reaching geopolitical consequences that affect the Middle East and the wider world. As Israel continues its military operations, the region's fragile balance of power is being tested, and global alliances are being put under strain. Neighboring countries such as Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon are closely monitoring the situation. Egypt has historically played a crucial role as a mediator, leveraging its political influence to negotiate temporary truces and humanitarian access. Jordan, home to a large Palestinian population, has publicly condemned civilian casualties and urged Israel to respect international law. Lebanon, already destabilized by political and economic crises, faces the threat of spillover from the conflict, particularly along its southern border near Gaza. The Gulf states, including Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, are also engaged. Qatar has provided humanitarian aid and diplomatic support, while the UAE has recently signaled a willingness to participate in international discussions aimed at stabilizing the region. These countries are balancing their own strategic interests with a moral and political imperative to address the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Gaza. The Gaza conflict intersects with the interests of major world powers. The United States has traditionally been a strong ally of Israel, providing military, economic, and diplomatic support. Recent developments, including UN condemnations and the recognition of Palestinian statehood by several countries, have complicated U.S. policy, forcing Washington to navigate between supporting Israel's security and addressing mounting international criticism over civilian casualties. European nations, including the UK, France, and Germany, are grappling with similar dilemmas. Public opinion across Europe strongly favors a humanitarian approach, yet strategic alliances and economic ties with Israel complicate direct intervention. Calls for a ceasefire, sanctions, or international investigations are balanced against the potential repercussions for bilateral relations and regional stability. The United Nations plays a central role in monitoring the conflict and advocating for the protection of civilians. The recent findings by a UN commission suggesting potential genocide have intensified scrutiny of Israel's military actions. International law, including the Geneva Conventions, emphasizes the protection of civilians, and any violation may lead to legal, diplomatic, and economic consequences. However, enforcing international law remains a challenge. The UN relies on consensus among member states, and veto powers within the Security Council can stall decisive action. This dynamic highlights the limitations of global governance in resolving conflicts where major powers have vested interests. Amid military operations, humanitarian diplomacy has emerged as a critical tool. Countries and NGOs are advocating for immediate relief, ceasefire agreements, and the safe passage of aid. Soft power initiatives, including public diplomacy campaigns and international advocacy, aim to pressure Israel and other stakeholders to comply with humanitarian norms. One unprecedented example is the Israeli military's broadcast of Prime Minister Netanyahu's UN speech directly into Gaza via loudspeakers. While intended as a psychological operation, it sparked international controversy, illustrating the complex intersection of media, warfare, and diplomacy. The ongoing crisis in Gaza has long-term implications for regional stability and global politics. Prolonged conflict risks radicalization, displacement, and the further deterioration of already fragile states in the Middle East. Diplomatic failures could embolden similar military actions elsewhere, eroding international norms and fueling cycles of violence. Conversely, successful mediation and humanitarian intervention could establish a framework for conflict resolution and regional cooperation. The world watches closely, understanding that Gaza's fate is intertwined with broader questions of peace, justice, and international accountability. The Gaza conflict is a test of global diplomacy, regional stability, and moral responsibility. As Israel presses its military objectives and the international community responds, the choices made now will shape the future of the region and set precedents for how the world addresses humanitarian crises. The situation remains fluid, but the call for decisive, principled action is clear. From emergency aid to high-level diplomacy, every effort counts in mitigating human suffering and advancing the possibility of a sustainable peace. Conversely, successful mediation and coordinated international intervention could establish a framework for conflict resolution and regional cooperation. How the world responds now may define the future balance of power in the Middle East for decades to come. World leaders face mounting pressure to address the humanitarian catastrophe. From emergency aid packages to ceasefire negotiations, the role of international organizations and coalitions like the United Nations, the European Union, and the Arab League is critical. Coordinated diplomatic pressure could halt further civilian casualties, allow humanitarian corridors to operate safely, and lay the groundwork for meaningful peace talks. Media coverage continues to shape global understanding and influence policy. With social media amplifying real-time footage from Gaza, public opinion worldwide increasingly demands accountability. Images of bombed hospitals, displaced families, and overcrowded shelters compel governments to act and inform citizens about the severity of the crisis. The broadcast of Prime Minister Netanyahu's UN speech in Gaza is a stark example of psychological and media warfare, but the world watches closely as narratives clash between humanitarian reporting and state messaging. The next phase in Gaza will likely be defined by a mixture of continued military pressure, diplomatic engagement, and humanitarian relief efforts. How quickly international stakeholders respond and the level of cooperation achieved will determine whether the region slides further into instability or moves toward a sustainable resolution. The stories of those affected, however, remain at the heart of this crisis. Human lives, not politics, are at stake. While geopolitical analyses offer context, the reality on the ground is most compellingly understood through the eyes of Gaza's residents. In the next segment, we will hear from survivors, healthcare workers, and aid volunteers, providing a deeply human perspective on life amid bombs, blockades, and constant fear. These narratives reveal the courage, resilience, and suffering of ordinary people, whose lives are disrupted daily by conflict beyond their control. While global leaders debate and strategize, it is the residents of Gaza who face the immediate consequences of the conflict. Hundreds of thousands are trapped in the city, enduring constant bombardment, shortages of food and medicine, and the fear that the next strike could be fatal. Families like that of the Nuseirat refugee camp have been decimated. One survivor recounted the horror. "We were in our home when the bombs fell. We lost 9 relatives in an instant, and our home was destroyed. There is nowhere to run. We are surrounded, hungry, and scared every second." Stories like these underscore the devastating toll on civilians, many of whom are women and children. Hospitals, the last lifeline for many, are struggling to function. At Shifa Hospital, Dr. Mohammed Abu Selmiya reported, "Tanks were approaching the hospital, and drones flew overhead. We could barely move patients, yet we continue to treat the wounded." Helu Hospital, treating premature babies in incubators, was forced to close its main gate due to safety concerns. Doctors and nurses are working under extreme conditions, often risking their lives to save others. International organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, are stepping in to provide aid, yet their efforts are hampered. Jacob Granger, MSF Emergency Coordinator, stated, "We had no choice but to suspend activities because our clinics were encircled by Israeli forces. The most at-risk people, including infants and those with severe injuries, were left in grave danger. Beyond physical destruction, the psychological toll is immense. Children live in constant fear, unable to attend school safely or play outside. Families experience trauma from repeated airstrikes and the loss of loved ones. Mental health services are in short supply, and the stress of survival dominates daily life." In a controversial move, Netanyahu's speech to the UN was broadcast into Gaza using loudspeakers and reportedly through telephones. While intended as a form of public diplomacy or psychological pressure, residents reported confusion and anger. Many see it as a stark reminder of the imbalance of power and the constant presence of the conflict in their lives. Despite the devastation, the resilience of Gaza's residents shines through. Communities organize to share scarce resources, volunteer to help the wounded, and support one another emotionally. Stories of bravery, from neighbors rescuing those trapped under rubble to volunteers delivering medicine under fire, reveal the strength and courage that persist amid chaos. The personal narratives of Gaza remind the international community that the human cost of conflict cannot be measured in numbers alone. Each life lost, each home destroyed, and each childhood disrupted adds urgency to calls for ceasefire, humanitarian access, and diplomatic solutions. As the situation in Gaza intensifies, international pressure on Israel has grown significantly. The United Nations, human rights organizations, and numerous countries have called for an immediate ceasefire, warning that continued violence could exacerbate a humanitarian catastrophe. A UN Commission inquiry has even stated that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute genocide, highlighting the severity of the crisis and the urgent need for global intervention. In a historic diplomatic shift, nations including the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Australia have officially recognized Palestinian statehood. This recognition has emboldened advocates for Palestinian rights and intensified scrutiny of Israel's military operations. Political analysts note that this may alter the balance of international opinion and increase pressure on Israel to halt attacks and negotiate peace. Around the world, demonstrations supporting Palestinians have erupted. From London to New York, Paris to Sydney, protesters have demanded an end to the bombing campaigns and respect for human rights. These demonstrations, coupled with social media campaigns, have amplified voices from Gaza, ensuring that the human toll of the conflict remains at the forefront of global consciousness. Diplomatic efforts are ongoing, with key players urging both sides to negotiate. International mediators have highlighted the need for a comprehensive ceasefire to protect civilians and allow humanitarian aid to reach those in dire need. However, military actions continue, complicating negotiations and intensifying the sense of urgency. Healthcare systems remain on the brink of collapse. Doctors, nurses, and aid organizations are calling for immediate access to medical supplies, food, and fuel. Hospitals struggle to function amid ongoing bombardment, leaving the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and the injured, at extreme risk. International NGOs are pushing for secure corridors for aid delivery, but access remains limited. Politically, the conflict is testing international alliances and domestic leadership in numerous countries. Leaders face pressure from citizens, human rights groups, and global institutions to take a firm stand. The recognition of Palestine by multiple states signals a potential shift in long-standing foreign policy approaches and may redefine diplomatic relations in the Middle East. The broadcasting of Netanyahu's UN speech into Gaza via loudspeakers and reportedly through phones is emblematic of the psychological and media dimensions of the conflict. While intended as strategic messaging, it has sparked outrage and further highlighted the asymmetry of power between the warring parties. Media coverage, both traditional and social, plays a pivotal role in shaping international perception and galvanizing action. The Gaza crisis is a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of global engagement. Sustained international pressure, humanitarian support, and diplomatic intervention are essential to prevent further loss of life. The resilience of Gaza's residents, coupled with global solidarity, offers a glimmer of hope amid devastation. As the world watches, it is crucial that awareness translates into action. Ensuring that humanitarian aid reaches those in need, diplomatic efforts are prioritized, and accountability is enforced. The path forward is complex, but with sustained global attention, it is possible to mitigate further suffering and work toward a just resolution. If you found this coverage insightful, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to help spread awareness of the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Your engagement can help ensure these stories reach a wider audience and that global attention remains focused on the plight of civilians caught in conflict.